8. It's Matthew 24, 1 through 31. Matthew 24. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" And Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Jared, I'll have you come on up. I'll pray for you. Father, thank you for this message, and I pray that you would speak to us through Jared this morning and give us comfort that you are coming back again one day. You are powerful. You are in control of all the things that seem to be going well in our lives and all the things that don't seem to be going so well. You are the King of all, and you are good, and you love us. Remind us of that, and I pray that you would help us to understand more about who you are and worship you more this morning. We pray all this name in your name, Jesus. Amen.
All right, we're in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 24. Jason just read this text. It's pretty weighty. Did you feel that? It's like, oh man, do you guys, if you're new with us, do you guys preach on that stuff every week? Well, no, but when it comes up, this is one of the strengths of teaching through books of the Bible, that when it comes up, we don't bypass it. The real topic at hand and question at hand is, are we living in the end times? Are we living in the end of an age? How many of you have had thoughts like that in the last handful of years about like, are these the end times? I wonder if those have been conversations that you've been a part of or thoughts that you have had. This text that we're in this morning, it speaks of the end of things. And Matthew 24 is one of the most difficult texts or portions of Jesus' teaching in the whole Bible to make sense of. One thing that is pretty wild about Jesus is that he is regularly afflicting the comfortable. It's what he's doing with this teaching. There's so much undermining and challenging of our preconceived notions or thoughts about how the world and relationships and he even works. He's regularly afflicting the comfortable, but one thing that Jesus also does is he regularly comforts the afflicted too. And he gives us promises, and he gives us warnings, and he helps us navigate the way forward. How do we please God? How do we live together in community? He does this not only in his teaching, but Jesus also does this in his way of life and how he operates. And so just take a moment and consider, if you're a student of the Bible, as you read the words of Jesus on these pages, or you've been in other places in the scriptures, I love to see the wisdom, and I love to see the power, and I love to see God's glory on the pages of my Bible. Let's just take a moment and consider like the person of Jesus Christ and how different he is than all of us. Like I've said, there's a ton in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 24 especially, that's difficult to untangle, but there is no doubt that we have to wrestle with it. There's no doubt that we've got to wrestle with this kind of stuff. As disciples, we can't just ignore the angles of Jesus that make us uncomfortable. We don't want to be a people who just go to the good stuff and kind of avoid the harder things. Matthew 24 that Jason read, the first portion of it, actually the whole thing and a portion of chapter 25 is called the Olivet Discourse. So Jesus, this is his last summary of teaching. He's been tangling with the religious rulers. He's got his game face on, tons of confrontation. He's given them hard words. They refuse his words. And now Jesus leaves the temple, the presence of God, literally in the person of Jesus, exits the temple, goes to the east to this nearby mountain called the Mount of Olives. And he sits his disciples down and he begins to teach them and warn them of the things to come. It's called the Olivet Discourse, and it's about the end of an age. And I think that the more you and I sit in this text, particularly the first portion of Matthew 24, that we will see that the dominant theme is actually about the end of the Jewish age rather than the end of world history. There's some allusions to the end of world history, and there's simultaneously some of that work is being done. There's near prophecy. It's coming soon in AD 70, which would be the end of the Jewish age. And really, Jesus is ushering in the new covenant era, the church age. But also embedded is some far out prophecy too here. And so we've got to do some work and try to figure out what exactly is he saying? What is going on here? I do think that chapter 24 for sure goes to like the end of things, the end of world history. And we're going to look at that next week. And I'm going to circle back around next week and try to tie 24 together in a more complete way. But here is how Matthew chapter 24 can help you and I. Here's how it can help us. In our day, there are a lot of people talking about the end times, the last days, the last things. The word for it is eschatology. And I know you're probably not going to believe this, but there is a lot of crazy stuff on the internet these days. And there are a lot of crazy people saying a lot of crazy things on the internet these days. So as God's faithful people, my burden for us is that we let his word, the scriptures, do the informing on the topic over and above our Google searches, over and above what our search engines and our social media feeds and our news feeds provide. I believe that if we've got good handles on how the Bible speaks of prophecy, and we've got good handles on apocalyptic literature like the book of Revelation and Daniel and Ezekiel and this portion of Matthew, that we're actually going to be better positioned to handle the unbiblical takes that we come across and on the internet, or the eccentric conversations that we encounter with the people in our lives. We're going to be better positioned to handle it if we know what Matthew 24 is saying. Now, I'm going to give you my direction this morning. Matthew 24, 1 through 31, this is what I believe, and disagree all you want. That's great. I think that it's speaking more, hear that word, I think it's saying more about the end of the Jewish age and the end of Judaism and the fulfillment of the law and Moses and the prophets than it is actually saying about the end of world history, the first portion of Matthew 24 that we're in today. Verses 1 through 28 are primarily about the end of the Jewish era. Notice I've said more about and primarily about. I haven't said it discount the end of world history. There's allusions to it, but I think it's more about the end of the Jewish era and temple worship and the law of Moses. Verses 29 through 31 could also be about the end of the Jewish era, but they probably are more direct about the end of world history. Now, regardless of which era you and I are living in, there are things that Jesus is teaching to his disciples here in the day, these disciples who were gathered with him on the Mount of Olives. There are things that he is teaching them that apply to them then, and there's things right here in this text that apply to us now. So this is not just going to be a history lesson this morning. There are applications for how you and I conduct ourselves and show up in the world and live our lives. This text is going to show us three things, and here are my 3 points this morning. It's going to show us that Jesus knows the future. This text is going to show us that Jesus knows the future. His predictions to these disciples came wildly true, just 40 years after giving them. The second point is there are specific ways that Jesus wants you and I to engage whatever it is that happens in our futures. There are specific ways that specific posture, specific mindset, heart set that he wants us to engage whatever happens in our futures. And then the third point is this, that Jesus holds for eternity all those who belong to him. He is compassionate, and he is good, and he is trustworthy. So the context of Matthew 24, it's still Tuesday of Holy Week. Jesus is done tangling with the religious rulers. He's done giving his time and attention to these religious leaders. They're causing all kinds of trouble. They've chosen in their hearts and minds to destroy Jesus. And now he leaves, like I said, the temple area. He leaves the city of Jerusalem, and he begins to talk about real historical events that will sweep into Jerusalem within about 35 to 40 years. So here's the first point this morning. Jesus knows the future. This first point also is going to be the lion's share of my sermon this morning. It's going to take some time to work through, and then points 2 and 3 are going to be fairly obvious, and they're going to go pretty quickly. Jesus knows the future, and he predicts it with historical certainty. Bit of a background, historical background. The Romans will conquer Jerusalem, and they will thoroughly destroy the temple and much of the city and scatter the Jewish people throughout the known world in AD 70. And in the process of this, the Romans will also kill about 1 million Jewish people. It's going to be intense, and it's going to be troubling. And Jesus is calling these events, I want to say it over and over and over again, he knows the future. He's calling these events 35 to 40 years before any of it occurred. An extra biblical historian, a guy named Josephus, he named this the Jewish War. And so what's going on in the background is that there are political and religious and ethnic tensions in Jerusalem. and they're steadily growing. They're going on while Jesus is alive and doing his ministry, but as he goes to the cross and resurrects and ascends, they will continue to steadily grow. And so the main people groups in Jerusalem at this time are the Jews and the Greeks and the Romans. They're the ones occupying most of Jerusalem and Judea. And the Jews and the Greeks are really going at it. They've got a long history of conflict dating back about 200 years before all of this. And they begin to riot against each other. And the Romans are the ones who are in ultimate control. And so the Jews are accused through this rioting of not honoring the emperor. And so there was an emperor in AD 40, a guy named Caligula, who was a pretty intense and evil person. And he announced widely throughout Judea and in Jerusalem that he would erect a statue of himself, and he was going to place it right in the middle of the temple courts. Obviously, the Jewish people would have hated the news of this, and they would have raged against it, rightly so. And so he sends news that he's going to do this. Their blood pressure is way up through the roof, and another Roman named Publius managed to delay it, but all hell is breaking loose, literally, in the city of Jerusalem. And that very year, AD 40, AD 41, Caligula is assassinated by some of his own Roman troops before he could follow through with this threat to place the statue, this idol of himself in the temple. And what that did was that assassination prevented a full-scale war in Judea for a time. And after 40 AD, leading up to 70 AD, there's going to be revolts happening for the next 25 years until the Romans are so sick of all of this that they begin to issue a tax on the Jews who protested that tax. And then the Jews begin kind of attacking the Romans in these guerrilla warfare style attacks. Well, the Romans, they want retribution and they want Jewish blood, and so they ended up killing about 6,000 Jews in Jerusalem. And this is all building, and the tension is building and kind of bound in this city. And in 66 AD, a full-scale war erupts in Jerusalem. But meanwhile in Rome, there's also civil war. There's also power struggles. Rome is fracturing. There's some infighting going on. And in 68 AD, you've probably heard of this emperor if you're familiar with the New Testament. An emperor named Nero was completely paranoid, persecuting Christians, persecuting people. He was out of his mind. He put to death a bunch of his family members, people in his cabinets and councils. And then finally in 68 AD, he killed himself. He committed suicide. That opened up a new power struggle in Rome, and a general in Nero's army named Vespasian ended up assuming the emperorship in Rome, became emperor. And he had a son, and his son was named Titus. And Titus was also a general, and so he sends his general son, Titus, to Jerusalem to be done with this issue. And so Titus launches this war against the city of Jerusalem, cuts off the city in 66 AD, cuts it off of supplies, water, goods, commerce, food, and the Jewish people are hunkered down in the city of Jerusalem for about 4 years while Rome just continues to cut it off and attack it. And in 70 AD, they had had enough, and they full-on stormed the city and ended up destroying Jerusalem and destroying the temple. And that ensuing war, Jews were so desperate that they were resorting to cannibalism. They were eating feces. They had no water. Disease and famine was spreading throughout. It was absolutely beyond what any of us have lived through or can imagine. And in that time period, over 1 million Jews were killed at the hands of the Romans. Beyond a nightmare. Not to mention there were earthquakes occurring, false messiahs rising up, these little Christ figures who were like, I can save you, I can put it back together, whether they're on the Roman side in the city of Rome, or whether they're Herodians, or whether they're the Pharisees, or whether they're false Christians rising up saying, I'm the the Messiah. So there's all kinds of just chaos. I wanted to give you that history to let you know like what was actually happening and what has been documented in history. And I believe that this is what Jesus is describing in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 28. But again, as Jesus is telling the disciples this, none of it has happened yet. None of it has occurred. And so if we pay attention to the disciples' question, when will these things be? He's like, I'm going to, not one stone will be left on another in this temple. And they go, how will this be? What is the sign of your coming? What is the sign of the end of days? We're going to see that Jesus is predicting some very surprising things. And most or all of them will occur within one generation, which Jesus alludes to in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, which we're not in this morning, but we'll be in next week. Look at verses 1 through 3. Jesus leaves this temple. The presence of God leaves the temple in Jerusalem. This is reminiscent of something that had occurred in the first temple period in Ezekiel, where God had handed over the Jewish people because of their rebellion to the Babylonians who would come in and sack the city. But before that occurred, and that first temple was destroyed, the presence of God, we read in Ezekiel, left the city, went to the east, and resided on the Mount of Olives. So Jesus doing this, moving out of the city and out of the temple to the Mount of Olives, is reminiscent of what was occurring during that first temple period too. It's just history, but I don't want you to miss the fact that God himself, Jesus Christ, is leaving the temple. Essentially, it's an act of judgment, saying, I'm handing you over now. And as he does it, these disciples, they're good tourists. They're like, hey, they're gawking at the buildings and the temple plaza and the temple itself. And he goes, I'm telling you guys, not one stone is going to be left on another. But for these disciples and for the Jewish people, Jerusalem and the temple are so well established. It's the heart of Jerusalem. It's the heart of Jewish worship. Jerusalem is one of the world's most splendid cities at this time, and well-established cities as well. And the temple itself is made of these massive limestone blocks cut by hand, assembled gold and wood and fabric and stone. And this temple stood about 150 feet tall. To give you reference, the Coeur d'Alene Resort is about 225 at its peak. So this is a massive building. But the temple plaza, this whole temple area, sat on about 450 acres. If you know anything about land size, that is massive, massive. There's walls surrounding it as well. It's just huge for the first century. In just a generation, it's all going to be gone. And Jesus is going, and most of you guys are still going to be alive to see it, to witness it. So let's step back for just a minute. Imagine that I said to you, while everybody here, while all of us are still alive, the U.S. is going to be invaded by a foreign army. And what's going to happen is our government will be broken and our government will be scattered. And so our White House and our monuments and our government buildings will be destroyed, and all 50 states will be completely disbanded. And the headquarters of our great nation are going to be relocated to Beijing. Imagine for a moment, our imaginations can conceive something like that happening, but it's probably very difficult if I were to come and say, this is going to happen within 40 years, we'd look around at our infrastructure and our army and our government and our people and our national pride, and we go, no way. There's not a way that that's going to happen. But Jesus talks about this privately with his disciples, and these guys are astounded at this thought. And they go, Jesus, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming, Jesus, and the end of the age. Naturally, they were troubled because they trusted Jesus, because they've seen him predict future things. They've seen him do wild and crazy things in front of them, healing people and making people whole, and just the power of his wisdom. They trusted him. And in verses 4 through 14, Jesus answers with this warning about jumping to hasty conclusions about the end. And his very first statement in verse 5 is, see to it that no one leads you astray. That's his first word. See to it that no one leads you astray. And so Jesus' idea here is that there's going to be temptations for them as trouble comes to see things differently than how Jesus calls them, because things will get so bad and some time is going to pass, and there are going to be some people who seem like they've got it going on that are going to rise up and that are going to try to woo them to their own cause. But Jesus knows the future, and he spells out in this text observable signs. And so Jesus is telling those disciples, do not get duped. Don't fall for it. In the coming days, you're going to experience some terrible things, and these things they're going to tempt you to discard my teaching and go another way. Don't do it. And so Jesus gives these disciples some things to look for. He tells them to be on the lookout for people that are falsely claiming to be Christ, whether it's him or whether it's just messianic, I can save it, I can fix it, I can put it back together again kind of figures. People falsely claiming to be Christ. He warns them, be on the lookout for wars and rumors of wars. Be on the lookout for famines in the land. Be on the lookout for this word pestilences, which means diseases. And then be on the lookout for earthquakes as well. Now, R.C. Sproul really helped me see this. He's a theologian who's with the Lord now, Yoda smart, talks about how quickly news in our day spreads. And so the question for us, like as we're going, false messiahs, earthquakes, diseases, famines, wars and rumors of wars, when are we not seeing these kinds of things in our news feeds? Think about it for a moment. Like when are we, where we can identify on top of the page, Fox or CNN or whatever neutral site you found. I would love to find one of those. I don't know if they exist anymore. But we're seeing all kinds of this sort of news. But in the disciples' day, news came to them glacier slow. So slow. By foot, by word of mouth. And they're living in a land, this land of Judea, it's the size of Maryland. And so for them to expect all of these things to come together at one time, and for them to see all of these things begin to occur at one time, would be significant for them. And when they would see it, Jesus said, this is the beginning of the birth pains. Things are happening. Be on the lookout. In other words, the contractions are starting, but there's more to come. The baby isn't quite here yet. He says in verses 19 through 14, then they, enemies, will deliver you guys, he's talking to these disciples, they will deliver you up to tribulation, they'll put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. The word for nations here is this Greek word ethnos, and it doesn't just mean people who are citizens of a country, but it means ethnic groups. You're going to be hated by the people of the known world for my name's sake. And many people, my kind of interpretation here, are going to crumble under pressure. They're going to bite and devour one another. They're going to destroy one another. You're not going to know who to trust. And in the midst of all of this, false teachers are going to seize the moment. And because everybody is doing whatever is right in their own eyes, people's love and trust for one another is going to grow cold. Verse 13, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The end of what? The end of the Jewish era or the end of the world? The end of this Jewish era and what they're experiencing in AD 70 is probably an allusion to how bad things are going to be. So they are going to be experiencing some troubling things, but this is also, I think, a far out prophecy for us, alerting us to the world is going to experience incredible chaos and trouble at the end of days. And then he says in verse 14, the gospel of the kingdom is going to be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all of the nations, and then the end will come. Which end? The Jewish era or the end of the world? It's probably both. Both of them are probably in his view. But think about this for a moment. Because what's going to happen in Jerusalem between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension, and then in AD 70, the fall of Jerusalem, the disciples are going to be, these very people that Jesus is talking to, they're going to be scattered, and they're going to preach the gospel, and the church of Jesus is going to rapidly expand throughout the known world. And the church is going to, by AD 70, reach into Europe, reach into Asia, and reach into Africa. The gospel is going to be proclaimed through that known world. Look at the context about this specific crisis in Judea in verses 15 through 22, specifically, really 28. He says, when you see remember his original audience, he's talking to these disciples. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, when you see that standing in the holy place, in the temple, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So this abomination of desolation is some sort of idol worship that gets erected in the temple area. It's probably already been partially fulfilled in 168 BC by a Greek ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, where he sacrificed pig's flesh on the altar and idols of himself. The Jews revolted and ended up saving and preserving the temple then, but also Titus, this general in AD 70, will come into Jerusalem and will desecrate the temple. He will destroy, desolate the temple area. Is it Antiochus? Is it Titus? Is it something in the future? We don't exactly know. Luke 21, verse 20 has a similar account of what Jesus is teaching in Matthew 24 here. And one of the things that Luke records is Luke 21, he says that Jesus says, when you see armies surrounding Jerusalem, let those who are in Judea, we see that in our text, flee to the mountains. Where are you right now? Not a trick question. There are probably some of us who will never make it to Judea. So how are we going to flee to the mountains outside of Judea if we're not in Judea? This portion of Scripture is a very particular and specific instruction to these disciples. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who's on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. There's urgency. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. What if I work in an office building? And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, because they're going to feel like lawbreakers on the Sabbath. There are going to be times when the Sabbath regulations have gates of the city and commerce is completely closed, and people are going to not allow you to do things, to flee, to travel large distances. Jesus says in verse 21, for then there will be a great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and will never be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anybody says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there he is, don't believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders. They'll fool people so as to lead astray, if possible, even the people of God, even the elect. Look at verse 25. See, I have told you beforehand. So, purpose clause, I've told you beforehand. So, if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, it's a big event, everybody can see it. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Jesus is probably talking here about the end of the end. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Such a great tribulation that had it not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, this is speaking of God's covenant people, as these original disciples would have probably heard those words, the words of the elect, their understanding would be that the elect are the Jewish people at this time, the people of God, those under the covenant of Abraham and those under the covenant of Moses. I think that contextually, everything that Jesus warns his disciples about in the first half really of chapter 24 can be explained in light of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD and the end of this Jewish or Judaic era. The end of the Jewish era was not relegated only to a demise, but it's actually the beginning of the new covenant era. There's this overlap with Jesus' life and death and resurrection, and then the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70, where this new covenant era is fully inaugurated. When you read Matthew 24, I really want you to be informed and aware of what Jesus is saying, so that when your crazy uncle, Rico, comes and starts talking all kinds of smack about what is going to happen, spouting about the stuff in Matthew 24 that's going to go down in our next election year, you'll actually be able to come to the text and go, I don't think you're reading it right. Let's talk about this a little bit more. Jesus knows the future, and he predicts with historical accuracy what will occur in just a few decades from when he's telling the disciples this. Point number 2, there are specific ways that Jesus wants us to engage whatever happens in our futures. This is where I think the rubber will really meet the road for us. In verse 5, he says, see to it that nobody leads you astray. For example, beware of jumping to hasty eschatological conclusions. That's a big word. Eschatology is the word for the last days. Beware of just jumping headlong into these hasty conclusions about how it's all going to go down. And then in verse 6, he says this other imperative, which is a bit of a command, see that you're not alarmed. Now, personally for me, when things look bleak, I tend to freak out a bit. Jesus is describing a pretty bleak picture of what is to come. And Jesus with these disciples is blatant with them about the fact that they're going to experience big suffering. Big suffering. Tribulation, death, and hatred. Friends denying Christ. Betrayal, lawlessness, lovelessness. We live in a world filled with dangers. Imagine for a moment if there was no such thing as a warning. Like if warnings didn't exist. There's nothing to warn the little toddler about running headlong towards the open stove as a parent is taking something out of the stove. There's no orange signs on the highway. There's no double yellow lines right before a curve, right? There's no instruments on an airplane's dash. You're literally flying by the seat of your pants. There's no ring on the cute girl or guy's finger to kind of warn you, like, don't go there. There's no vitals or monitors in the ICU. There's no revelation from God or Bible in our hands. There's no warning. It would be a world of chaos and destruction and pain and suffering and injury and death, right? But there are warnings in our world. That's not the reality. We do have warnings. Reality is that there's danger everywhere, and danger is a significant threat to us. So there are warnings. And Jesus, he knows that there are significant dangers on the path ahead for Jesus' disciples. And so what Jesus does is he names them. He says, see that no one leads you astray. This applies to us too, which means expect that there are going to be people in our time, in their time, who are going to come to us and try to do just that. They're going to try to get us to follow something that is contrary to the revelation of God in Scripture and the real Jesus on his pages. He says in verse 6, see to it that you're not alarmed, which means when things look dire and bleak and you're tempted to freak out because of all of the war and the death and the famine and the disease, talk your soul down. Take precaution. Keep your cool. Look for the signs, but keep your eyes on the King, who is above and over all of this. In verse 13, he gives another command. He says, persevere. If we receive an early warning, we can choose now what we do with that warning then. So our bodies are full of biomarkers like enzymes and like hormones and like heart rate and blood pressure and urinalysis, which are all these biological early warning systems. And when we heed these early warning systems and follow their guidelines, it can lead us into longevity. It can lead us into improved health. In a similar way, Jesus' words are just that. It's an early warning system that is guiding us, that is showing us a way forward. See that no one leads you astray means stay close to Jesus and stay close to his teaching. Keep your eyes on him and on his way. Become students of his words in the scriptures. See to it that you're not alarmed, which means keep your cool and remember his promises. And persevere means stay the course. Keep your head. Keep your faith. Bear with the things in your life, the things that are coming down the pike in culture, for in due time there will be relief and you will reap a reward. Don't be led astray. Don't be alarmed. Persevere is solid counsel for our whole life, not just when things get hard, but our whole life. And for these disciples, their entire world would be shaken, top to bottom, in AD 70. He says in verse 25, see, I've told you beforehand. I've told you beforehand. I've warned you. What is Matthew 24 about? It's about keeping our eyes on the one who rules over wicked kings and kingdoms, over the good and over the evil, who will see all things into their proper place at the end of days. Here's my third point, and it's a quote from a guy named Michael Green, and we'll end here. The point is this: Jesus holds for eternity all those who belong to him. Listen to this quote. The kingdom has come, the kingdom of God has come with the first coming of Jesus. The kingdom of God has been inaugurated, it's been started, but it has not yet been consummated or finalized. Therefore, disciples are citizens of two countries. They belong to both this age and to the age to come. That's us. We live at the intersection of the ages. The kingdom of God inaugurated at the first coming of Jesus will be consummated by Jesus' return at the end of history. Then his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, Michael Green quotes from Shakespeare's Macbeth, and he says this: history is not a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, end quote. History is, in a real sense, his story, God's story. He made this world. He came to dwell in it. He will return at the end of history to wind it all up. That is the Christian hope. History is moving steadily toward that grand day. We shall not go out like a light. We shall not be blown sky high in a nuclear holocaust. We shall not destroy the earth by our environmental vandalism. This world will not, however, go on forever. Jesus will come again, not this time to suffer, but to reign. At his coming will settle the future destiny of all people. We'll get to that next week. That is the central point of this chapter. At the end of things, we shall see Christ as he is. It is not a question of rewards and punishments. Matthew does nothing to encourage detailed millennial expectations or speculation about the rapture. He steadily fixes our eyes on the King who is one day coming back to be crowned. And that is something to look forward to. That is something no vision of the future in any religion or philosophy can match. It is good news. Our King knows the future. Our King has a will for how you and I engage with whatever happens in our future. And our King holds for eternity all of those who belong to him. So the question is, do you belong to him? That's the question laid before all of us. If not, the scriptures say, believe that the Lord Jesus is the Son of God, who has lived perfectly in your place, who has died in your place as the perfect substitute for your sin. Substitutionary atonement is that his blood will pay for, his righteous blood will pay for our unrighteousness. And as we believe that he has gone into the grave and risen from the dead on the third day and is no longer dead like every other world religion leader or prophet, but actually reigns at the right hand of the Father forevermore, you will be saved. Saved from what? From the end of time? No, saved from the wrath of God that hangs on our heads as those of us who have rejected him. We will be spared. And not just spared, brought up to zero, but brought into the family of God, made sons and daughters of the King, never to be put out or pushed away in shame. Never. He holds all those for eternity who are his. And if that's you, there's a key way to respond, and it's through belief, and it's through confessing that Jesus Christ is Lord and that he is raised from the dead, believing that in your heart and confessing with your mouth. You come into the family of God just like that. And then you follow him with God's strength that he provides for all the days of your life. And one of the early responses and acts of obedience is baptism. And so you go into the baptismal waters, signifying the death of your old man or woman and this resurrection to new life. Behold, the old is gone and the new has come. Whoever is in Christ is a new creation. And then the question for those of you who do belong to him, are you listening to him? Are you following him? Are you surrendering to him? That's the question for us. You know where to apply that. You know what shows up in your life, as I know what shows up in mine. And may the Holy Spirit reveal your next step. Pray with me. Lord Jesus, we love you and we submit to you. Lord Jesus, would you work through your Spirit in this room to confirm for us that we are children of God, to confirm for us that we're standing on the outside of your family and that you're calling us to come in. Would you move hearts to believe, to ask the necessary questions, to push in and not to avoid the hard questions? Would you call us to yourself in new ways today? And thank you that your promise is that you continue to call us to yourself for all of our days. You will see us through. In Jesus' name, amen.